everyone, and welcome to our very first Reconstruction lesson. At this point, you should have finished the Civil War unit, and in that Civil War unit where we stopped right at the very end of the Civil War, and some of the effects that the Civil War had on the North and on the South. So we're going to pick up where we left off. We left off on April of 1865. And we remember that Lee surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April in 1865. We talked all about how they signed the ceasefire, and this was the official mark that the war was over. On April 10th, 1865, celebrations began in Washington, D.C. The war was finally over. This war has now been going on for almost 5 years, and people were very excited to see that it was over. Do you remember, though, that we talked about the difference between the North and the South by the end of the war? The South was completely destroyed and decimated, whereas the North was not necessarily thriving, but was going to have a much easier time rebounding after the war. They relied heavily on manufacturing, and that hadn't really been affected too much by the war, whereas the South relied heavily on agriculture, and their slaves had just been told they were free. Not only that, but most of the fighting took place in the South, so a lot of the major cities in the South had been destroyed. Then the American flag is finally raised again over Fort Sumter on April 14th, 1865. This was kind of a nice homage to where the war began. Remember, Fort Sumter was the very beginning of the Civil War, and the South had taken control of Fort Sumter back early on in the war. So this was kind of like a celebration that, okay, we're officially through this war. Fort Sumter is part of the Union again. And then it's like the record scratches because President Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater on April 14th, the same day the flag was finally raised over Fort Sumter, and he dies the following morning. So if you notice, less than 1 week after the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln is assassinated. So what does that mean? What's the country supposed to do? President Lincoln was this great man who was credited with saving the Union. He was the president and the leader during the Civil War, and now he's gone a week after the armistice or the ceasefire. His vice president, President Andrew Johnson, is going to have to step up to the bat and make some big moves to piece the country back together. As you can imagine, people in the South are not happy. People in the North still have a lot of resentment built up against people in the South. Then we also have this large population of slaves, and we don't really know what's going to happen. So, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the 3 amendments that are made to the United States Constitution immediately following the Civil War that changed the course of American history as we know it. The first one is the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment declared that slavery would not be allowed to exist in the United States. Remember when we talked about the causes of the Civil War? There were 2, slavery and states' rights. This amendment completely ended the conflict between people who are pro-slavery and anti-slavery. Now slavery was illegal. There was no in-between, no ifs, ands, or buts. This was the amendment that was meant to settle that dispute. We see a really great illustration here where we have the shackles being broken. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article, meaning Congress can step in and make sure that there is no slavery going on. It is illegal as of December 6, 1865. So we're looking at about 8 months, a little less than 8 months after the end of the war and President Lincoln was assassinated. Now, it took them a long time to ratify this. So this amendment had been going on, trying to be ratified by Congress for about a year by the time it was ratified in December of 1865. This is one of my very, very favorite political cartoons. It's not even really a political cartoon. It's just a cartoon that demonstrates the 13th Amendment. We see this slave who has just been at the bottom in all caps with an exclamation point, freed. And we see him looking up to the sky, essentially praising the Lord for his freedom. Okay, cool. I think we skipped one. Now we have the 14th Amendment. Notice we've got a big jump in time here. Our last amendment was in December of 1865. So here we're looking at almost 2.5 years until this next amendment comes along. This amendment declared that states could not limit the rights of citizens. States could not take away life, liberty, or property without due process of law or deny equal protection of the law. Well, as you can imagine, after the 13th Amendment, those slaves were freed, but that doesn't change people's hearts or the way that people believe or the way that people feel about African Americans. So even though they were technically free, there were a lot of things going on that were trying to prohibit these slaves from really being equal citizens in the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help kind of protect the rights of these African Americans. However, there were still all of these loopholes that they were trying to keep them working on the farms, and they were trying to essentially free the slaves without really freeing the slaves. So the 14th Amendment comes along to try and protect the slaves from all of these loopholes that people were finding. This amendment protected their rights. That's why we see right here in our illustration, we have the Civil Rights Bill, or essentially like a Bill of Rights being handed to an African American. This is the first time that not only are they citizens, but this is protecting their rights. The 14th Amendment is still a very, very relevant amendment today. If you pay attention to the news, any protests that talk about equal rights, whether it be for women or for people of different communities, we see that this 14th Amendment comes up a lot. This is a very modern protest sign where it says, "No state shall deny to any person equal protection of the law." So pay attention the next time you see some sort of protest on TV, on the news. I would bet you that the 14th Amendment is somewhere applicable in there. And finally, the 15th Amendment is the third and final amendment during the Reconstruction time period, and it was granted on February 3rd, 1870, so another big jump in time. And it gave all men the right to vote, no matter their skin color or if they had ever been enslaved. So one of those loopholes that people were trying to use to keep the African Americans from being an equal part of society was to keep them from voting. Because if you do remember, it did specify when the laws for voting were written that it had to be a white land-owning male. So the 15th Amendment comes along to change that. That's what an amendment is. An amendment is a change to the Constitution. To essentially change it so that all men, including freed slaves, could still vote. This does not include women. At this point in 1870, men are still the only ones can vote. But now it is not just white men, it is men of all color can vote. This is a good example of a political cartoon that talks about the 15th Amendment. We see all of these people waiting in a long, long line for the polling place, which is where you go to vote. If you've ever gone with mom or dad to a polling place, you know those lines can get so long. And we see this white man here asking the African-American man he is with, "Did you have to wait long?" And the African-American response says, "Only a few hundred years." So it's just a little subtle nod to the 15th Amendment. So think about it. What were the purposes of the amendments made to the Constitution in the years following the Civil War? And how do you think those amendments would be accepted by people living in the United States at the time? In our next lesson, we're going to talk all about the work of some certain organizations that were meant to protect the rights of African Americans during this time as the amendments were being ratified. And even after the amendments were ratified, there were still people trying to find loopholes. Couldn't just get it through their head that what's on the outside doesn't matter. So that's going to be it for us today. Be sure to do the Wiser Me check below, and I will see you historians tomorrow. Bye.